The wind carried screams across the Colorado plains that November evening. Not the cry of wild animals, but something far more chilling. Two young women, bound and shivering in torn dresses, pleaded with shadows that showed no mercy. "Take me instead," the older sister whispered through split lips. "Leave Emma alone. Please." But mercy was a currency these people had never learned to spend. Miles away, cattle rancher Jake Morrison heard something that made his blood run cold. It wasn't the sound of coyotes or wind through the canyon walls. It was the sound of human desperation, thin and raw, cutting through the November air like a blade. What he discovered that night would test everything he believed about justice, family, and the price of standing up to those who mistake cruelty for power. This is the story of how one man's choice to do what was right changed 3 lives forever, and why. Sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't fighting the monsters, but refusing to choose which innocent person deserves to be saved. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first thing Jake Morrison noticed wrong was the silence. After 15 years working the Double Creek Ranch in the shadow of the Colorado Rockies, he knew the language of his land. He knew how the cattle lowed when storms approached, how the wind sang different songs through summer grass versus winter sage, how even the coyotes had their rhythms and reasons. But this silence, thick, unnatural, wrong, pressed against his ears like cotton soaked in dread. Jake pulled his black gelding, Thunder, to a halt on the ridge overlooking Willow Creek. The November sky hung low and gray, pregnant with the season's first real snow. He'd been checking fence lines along the northern boundary of his property, the tedious but necessary work that kept a ranch running through the harsh Colorado winters. At 34, Jake had learned that survival in this country came down to preparation, routine, and paying attention to the details that kept both man and beast alive when the storms hit. But there was nothing routine about what he heard next. A scream, high and desperate, cut through the air like a hawk's cry. Then another voice, lower, pleading. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the rifle secured to his saddle, his gray eyes scanning the valley below. The sound had come from the direction of Crow's Nest Canyon, a narrow cut in the earth that marked the boundary between his land and the sprawling Patterson estate. The Pattersons. Jake's jaw tightened at the thought. Old money cattle barons who owned half the county and acted like they owned the other half too. Jeremiah Patterson had built his empire on the backs of smaller ranchers, using lawyers when he could and less civilized methods when legal pressure failed. Jake had tangled with the Patterson boys before, Caleb and Wade Patterson, Jeremiah's sons, who seemed to view cruelty as a family tradition passed down like a treasured heirloom. Another scream echoed across the valley, followed by male laughter that made Jake's skin crawl. He spurred Thunder down the rocky slope, his mount's hooves finding purchase on stone and scattered gravel. The gelding was sure-footed and intelligent, bred for this kind of mountain work, and Jake trusted him completely as they descended toward the source of the disturbance. The canyon walls closed in around them as they rode deeper into Crow's Nest. Ancient cottonwoods lined the creek bed, their bare November branches creating a skeletal canopy overhead. The sound of running water should have been peaceful, but the voices ahead turned the natural symphony into something sinister. "Please, I'm begging you," a woman's voice strained with exhaustion and terror. "Take me instead. Leave Emma alone. She's just 17. I'll do whatever you want, just please." "Shut your mouth, Rebecca," a man's voice snarled back. Jake recognized it immediately. Caleb Patterson, the elder of Jeremiah's 2 sons. A man who'd inherited his father's ruthlessness, but lacked the old man's strategic mind. "You both brought this on yourselves, running off like that, thinking you could just disappear. Did you really think we wouldn't find you?" Jake dismounted quietly, securing Thunder's reins to a low branch. He moved forward on foot, using the cottonwoods for cover, his rifle ready but held low. The November air was crisp enough to see his breath. and he forced himself to breathe slowly, steadily, despite the rage building in his chest at what he was beginning to understand. Through the trees, he could see them. Two young women, both with long auburn hair that caught what little light filtered through the grey sky. They were bound with rough rope, their wrists tied behind their backs, forced to kneel beside the creek. Their dresses, once fine, he could tell, were torn and muddy, speaking of a long, brutal journey. The older woman, Rebecca, kept herself positioned slightly in front of the younger one, Emma, even bound as she was. There was something fierce in her posture, despite her obvious exhaustion, a protective instinct that even rope and threats couldn't break. Emma was crying quietly, her slight frame shaking with cold and fear, but she wasn't hysterical. There was steel in both these women, Jake realized. Whatever they'd endured to get here, they hadn't broken. Standing over them were four men. Caleb Patterson, tall and lean, with the kind of cruel mouth that seemed permanently twisted into a sneer. His younger brother Wade, shorter but stockier, with dead eyes that Jake had seen in rabid animals, the look of something that enjoyed causing pain. Two other men Jake didn't recognize, probably hired guns from their appearance. All four wore heavy coats against the November cold, and all four looked like they were enjoying themselves far too much. The thing is, "Ladies," Wade Patterson said, crouching down to be level with the women, "you seem to think you had a choice in this matter. See, when my brother Marcus married Rebecca here, she became family. Patterson family. And when Marcus had that unfortunate accident with his horse," Wade's grin was pure malice, "well, that just made Rebecca a widow who needed looking after." "Marcus's death wasn't an accident," Rebecca said quietly, but her voice carried clearly in the canyon air. "And we all know it." The slap echoed off the canyon walls like a gunshot. Rebecca's head snapped to the side, but she didn't cry out. She just slowly turned back to face Wade, a thin line of blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. "Careful, sister-in-law," Wade hissed. "Accidents happen to folks who spread lies about the Patterson family." Jake had heard enough. He'd known Marcus Patterson briefly, Jeremiah's youngest son, who'd always seemed different from his brothers, gentler, the kind of man who might actually fall in love with a woman instead of just seeing her as property to be acquired. If Marcus had died in a convenient accident shortly after marrying Rebecca, it painted the Patterson family's current behavior in an even darker light. But it was what Caleb said next that made Jake's blood run cold. "Here's what's going to happen," Caleb announced, pulling a long hunting knife from his belt. The blade gleamed wickedly in the dim light. "Rebecca, you're coming back to the ranch where you belong. As for little Emma here," he stepped toward the younger woman, who shrank back as far as her bonds would allow. "Well, she's seen too much, heard too much, knows too much about what really happened to poor Marcus." "No." Rebecca's voice was steady, but Jake could hear the desperation underneath. "Please, Caleb, Emma doesn't know anything. She was away at school when Marcus died. She only came back for the funeral. Take me, do whatever you want with me, but let her go, please." "I'm afraid that's not how this works," Wade chimed in, clearly enjoying the moment. "See, Emma here is a loose end, and the Patterson family doesn't leave loose ends." Emma finally spoke, her voice young but remarkably steady. "You won't get away with this. People will ask questions when we don't come back to town." Caleb laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Who's going to ask questions about two women who were clearly depressed after the tragic loss of Marcus? Who ran off into the wilderness in their grief? It's a dangerous country out here. Wild animals, sudden storms, accidents." He shrugged with mock sympathy. "So many ways for people to just disappear." That's when Jake stepped out of the trees. "I can think of a few more ways," he said quietly, his rifle now raised and aimed directly at Caleb's chest. The four men spun around, reaching for their weapons, but Jake's voice cut through their movement like a whip crack. "I wouldn't," he said, his tone conversational but edged with steel. "See, I've got you all in my sights, and this old Winchester has a real short trigger pull. First man who twitches wrong is going to find out just how accurate I am at this range." Caleb's hand had frozen halfway to his gun. His face was flushed with anger and something that might have been fear. "Morrison, Should have known you'd stick your nose where it doesn't belong. Funny thing about that, Jake replied, not moving the rifle an inch. Last I checked, this creek runs right along my property line. Makes this my business by definition. His eyes flicked briefly to the two women, taking in their condition, before returning to the four men. Now I'm going to give you boys one chance to ride away from here and forget this ever happened. Wade laughed, but it sounded forced. 4 against 1, Morrison. You sure you want to play those odds? Jake's smile was cold as the November wind. Son, I've been hunting in these mountains since before you learned to tie your boots. Killed my first bear when I was 16, and that was with a knife because my rifle misfired. You really think 4 soft ranch boys scare me? The truth was, Jake was calculating odds and angles with the part of his mind that had kept him alive through 2 tours with the army before he'd come home to work the ranch. 4 men, spread out but not in good cover. He could drop 2 before they could draw, maybe 3 if he was lucky. But that still left one with a clear shot at the women, and that was unacceptable. Besides, Jake continued, his voice still conversational, seems to me like you boys have forgotten something important about the law in these parts. What's that? Caleb demanded, though he still hadn't moved his hand toward his weapon. Kidnapping and attempted murder are hanging offenses, Jake said simply. And I'm a duly appointed deputy sheriff for this county. Gives me the authority to arrest you right here, right now, or shoot you if you resist. That was only partially true. Jake did carry a deputy's badge, but it was mostly ceremonial, meant to help him deal with rustlers and trespassers on his land. But the Patterson boys didn't need to know the limits of his authority. The standoff stretched for long seconds, tension thick as smoke in the cold air. Jake could see Caleb's mind working, trying to figure out if Jake was bluffing, if there was an angle he could play. But Wade, always the hothead, was already reaching for his gun. Enough of this, Wade snarled. Kill him! What happened next took less than 5 seconds, but felt like an eternity. Wade's hand cleared leather first, but Jake had been expecting it. The Winchester roared, and Wade Patterson spun around, clutching his shoulder, his pistol flying into the creek with a splash. The 2 hired guns went for their weapons simultaneously, but Jake was already working the bolt action, brass casings flying. His second shot took one man in the leg, dropping him screaming to the rocky ground. The third shot went wide as Jake dove for cover behind a fallen log, but it was close enough to make the remaining gunman think twice about his life choices. Caleb had his pistol out now, firing wildly in Jake's direction, but his shots were going high, panicked. Jake could hear one of the women, Rebecca, shouting something, but he couldn't make out the words over the gunfire echoing off the canyon walls. Then he heard Thunder's distinctive whinny, and Jake's heart sank. If these bastards hurt his horse, but it wasn't fear in Thunder's voice. It was the sound the gelding made when he was excited, energized. And that could only mean one thing. Jake risked a quick look over the log and nearly smiled despite the circumstances. Thunder had broken free from his reins, not hard for a horse trained to ground tie when necessary, and was charging straight at the remaining standing gunman. 1,500 pounds of well-trained ranch horse was bearing down on the man like a black avalanche, and the gunman's choice was simple. Shoot the horse and probably die anyway, or run. He chose to run. Caleb, seeing his hired help fleeing and his brother bleeding in the creek gravel, made the same choice. This isn't over, Morrison, he shouted as he grabbed Wade and hauled him toward their horses. The Patterson family doesn't forget. Neither do I, Jake called back, rising from cover with his rifle still ready. And next time you threaten innocent folks on my land, I won't be aiming for shoulders. The 4 men mounted up, Wade groaning and cursing as Caleb helped him into his saddle. Within minutes, the thunder of hoofbeats was fading into the distance, leaving Jake alone in the canyon with 2 traumatized women and the echo of gunshots bouncing off stone walls. Jake approached the women slowly, keeping his rifle lowered but ready. He'd learned in the army that people who'd been through trauma could be unpredictable, and he didn't want to frighten them any further. Ladies, he said quietly, pulling a knife from his belt. I'm Jake Morrison. I'm going to cut those ropes now. Rebecca looked up at him with eyes that were exhausted but alert. Are they gone? For now, Jake said honestly, kneeling behind her to slice through the ropes binding her wrists. But they'll be back. The Pattersons don't give up easy. The moment her hands were free, Rebecca turned to her sister, helping Jake free Emma's bonds. Both women were shivering in the November cold, their light dresses providing little protection against the mountain air. "Thank you," Rebecca said simply, her voice hoarse. "I'm Rebecca Collins. This is my sister Emma." "Collins?" Jake asked, something clicking in his memory. "You wouldn't be related to Robert Collins, would you? Used to run the mercantile in Pine Ridge?" Emma nodded, tears still fresh on her cheeks. "He was our father. He died last spring." That explained a lot. Jake remembered Robert Collins as an honest merchant who'd extended credit to struggling ranchers and never charged the exorbitant prices some of the other storekeepers did. If Rebecca had inherited the store, that would have made her a target for the Pattersons, who wanted to control every business in the county. "What happened to you?" Jake asked gently, though he thought he could guess most of it. Rebecca pulled her torn shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Marcus and I were married 6 months ago. He was different from his family, kind. He wanted to help me run the store, make it into something that could serve the whole community, not just the wealthy ranchers. And then he died," Jake said. "It wasn't a question. 3 weeks ago. His horse supposedly threw him near Devil's Canyon." Rebecca's voice was bitter. "Marcus was the best rider I ever knew. That horse was gentle as a lamb. But when I tried to ask questions, tried to look into what really happened," she gestured helplessly, "suddenly I was a grieving widow who needed to be taken care of by the family. They wanted the store," Emma added, her voice stronger now that the immediate danger had passed. "And they wanted Rebecca to marry Caleb. Said it would keep the family assets together." Jake felt sick. He'd known the Pattersons were ruthless, but this was beyond anything he'd imagined. "So you ran?" "Last night," Rebecca confirmed. "We packed what we could carry and tried to make it to the railroad in Durango. We thought if we could get to Denver, maybe find a lawyer who wasn't afraid of the Patterson name. They caught us at dawn," Emma finished. "Been dragging us around all day, trying to decide what to do with us. The November wind picked up, cutting through the canyon like a knife." Both women were shivering violently now, and Jake could see that Emma was close to exhaustion. "They needed shelter, warmth, and safety, in that order. Can you ride?" he asked. Rebecca nodded. "Both of us. Father made sure we learned." "Good." Jake whistled and Thunder trotted over, apparently pleased with his performance in the recent conflict. "There's a line shack about 2 miles from here. We can shelter there tonight, get you warmed up and fed. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." As he helped both women mount Thunder, Rebecca behind him, Emma in front where he could keep her steady, Jake found himself wondering what he'd gotten himself into. The Pattersons wouldn't give up. They had too much at stake, too much pride on the line. And Jake had just declared war on the most powerful family in the county. But as they rode toward the line shack, Emma leaning back against his chest for warmth while Rebecca held tight to his waist, Jake found he didn't care about the consequences. Some things were worth fighting for. Some people were worth protecting, and sometimes a man had to choose between what was safe and what was right. Jake Morrison had never been much for choosing the safe path anyway. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The line shack crouched against the mountainside like a weathered animal seeking shelter from the storm. Built decades ago by Jake's predecessor, it was a simple structure. 1 room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn walls, and a small loft accessible by a ladder. But it was solid, defensible, and most importantly, it was warm. Jake dismounted first, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. The temperature was dropping fast as darkness approached, and he could see snow beginning to dust the highest peaks in the distance. He helped Emma down carefully. The girl was swaying on her feet, exhaustion and shock finally catching up with her, then turned to assist Rebecca. "Easy," he murmured as she slid from Thunder's back. Her legs buckled slightly, and he caught her elbow to steady her. When's the last time either of you ate? Rebecca thought for a moment, her brow furrowing. Yesterday morning, I think. We had some bread and cheese before we left the house. She looked at her sister, who was leaning heavily against the cabin wall. Emma had even less. She was too nervous to eat, Jake nodded grimly. No food for over 24 hours, plus the trauma of being hunted and terrorized. It was a wonder both women were still conscious. He led Thunder to a small lean-to behind the cabin, quickly unsaddling the gelding and rubbing him down with a piece of burlap. The horse had earned his oats tonight. Inside the cabin, Jake worked with the efficiency of a man accustomed to solitude and self-reliance. He had the fire built and crackling within minutes, the warmth beginning to chase away the November chill. From a chest in the corner, he pulled out wool blankets, thick and rough but clean. He handed one to each sister, noting how Rebecca immediately wrapped hers around Emma's shoulders before taking a second blanket for herself. "There's a change of clothes in that trunk," Jake said, gesturing toward an old wooden chest. "Nothing fancy, but they're clean and warm. Men's clothes mostly, but they'll keep the cold out better than what you're wearing." Rebecca looked down at her torn dress. What had once been a fine traveling outfit was now little more than rags. "Thank you. That's very kind." Jake busied himself at the small stove, pulling supplies from the cabin's modest stores. Salt pork, beans, coffee, hardtack, trail food, but filling. As he worked, he found himself stealing glances at the two women. Now that they were in better light, he could see the full extent of what they'd endured. Rebecca was perhaps 24 or 25, with auburn hair that fell in waves to her shoulders and green eyes that held depths of strength beneath the exhaustion. There was something refined about her features, the bearing of someone who'd been raised with education and culture. But there was steel there too. The way she'd positioned herself between Emma and the Patterson men. The way she'd offered herself in place of her sister, that took a special kind of courage. Emma was clearly younger, maybe 18 at most, with the same auburn hair but brighter, more innocent eyes. Or they had been innocent. Jake could see the way today's events had aged her, put shadows in her gaze that shouldn't have been there for years yet. Both sisters bore the marks of rough handling. Rope burns on their wrists, bruises on Rebecca's face where she'd been struck, mud and tears in their clothing. But they were alive and they were safe. For now, as Jake prepared the simple meal, Rebecca and Emma retreated to the far corner of the cabin to change into the dry clothes. When they emerged, they looked younger somehow. Emma swimming in a flannel shirt that hung to her knees, Rebecca in wool pants and a thick sweater that emphasized how slight she really was. "Better?" Jake asked, ladling beans and salt pork onto tin plates. "Much," Rebecca said, settling beside the fire with Emma close beside her. "I can't remember the last time I felt truly warm." They ate in companionable silence for a while, the crackling fire and the sound of wind outside the only noise. Jake watched as both women gradually relaxed, the immediate fear leaving their posture as they realized they were, for the moment, safe. It was Emma who broke the silence first. "What you did back there," she said quietly, looking at Jake over her plate. "Facing down 4 armed men like that. Were you scared?" Jake considered the question as he sipped his coffee. "Scared? Yeah, I was scared. Any man who says he's not afraid when bullets start flying is either lying or too stupid to live long." He met her eyes. "But being scared doesn't mean you don't do what needs doing. You could have just ridden away," Rebecca said. There was no accusation in her voice, just wonder. "You didn't know us. It wasn't your fight." "Maybe not," Jake agreed. "But it became my fight the moment I saw what they were planning to do to you." He set down his coffee cup, his expression growing serious. "Besides, I knew your husband. Marcus came by my place a few times, talked about his plans for the mercantile, how he wanted to help the smaller ranchers get fair prices for supplies." Rebecca's face softened at the mention of her late husband. "He was a good man. Too good for his family. What really happened to him?" Jake asked gently. "I heard about the riding accident, but..." Rebecca and Emma exchanged a look, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Rebecca spoke, her voice low and carefully controlled. Marcus had been asking questions. about the family business, about some of the contracts his father had with the railroad, about why so many small ranchers were losing their land to the bank. She stared into the fire as she spoke. He found some papers in his father's study, documents that showed the Pattersons had been manipulating cattle prices, bribing railroad officials, even falsifying land surveys to claim property that didn't belong to them. Jake felt his jaw tighten. He'd suspected the Pattersons of shady dealings, but this was worse than he'd imagined. He confronted them about it. "Not directly," Emma said, speaking up for the first time since they'd started eating. Marcus was too smart for that. He knew how dangerous his family could be, but he made copies of the documents, hid them somewhere safe. He was planning to take them to the territorial authorities in Denver, and somehow they found out, Rebecca continued. The night before he died, Marcus seemed different, worried. He kept checking the locks on the doors, kept looking out the windows. He told me that if anything happened to him, I should take Emma and run. He said his family would never let me live if they thought I knew about the papers. The pieces were falling into place now. So when Marcus died, they came for you. Not immediately, Rebecca said. At first, they played the part of the grieving family, offered to help with the funeral arrangements, to take care of me in my time of need. But then they started pressuring me to marry Caleb, to keep the family together. When I refused, they got less subtle about their intentions. Jake finished, much less subtle. Rebecca's hand went unconsciously to her cheek, where a fading bruise was still visible. Yesterday was the final straw. Jeremiah Patterson himself came to the house with his sons, told me I had a choice: marry Caleb and turn over any papers Marcus might have left or face the consequences. That's when we ran, Emma added. Rebecca woke me up in the middle of the night, said we had to leave immediately. We took what we could carry and tried to make it to the railroad. Jake leaned back in his chair, processing everything he'd heard. The Pattersons weren't just local bullies. They were criminals on a grand scale, using murder and intimidation to build their empire. And now he'd put himself directly in their crosshairs by interfering with their plans. These papers Marcus hid, he said finally. Do you know where they are? Rebecca shook her head. He never told me. Said it was safer that way, but... She hesitated, glancing at Emma again. But what? Jake prompted. Emma might know, Rebecca said slowly. Marcus was always closer to her than to me in some ways. She was away at school during most of our courtship and marriage, but when she came back for the funeral, he spent a lot of time talking to her. Private conversations. All eyes turned to Emma, who was staring into the fire with a troubled expression. He did tell me something, she said finally. The day before the funeral, he pulled me aside and said that if anything ever happened to Rebecca, if she was ever in danger, I should look for the truth where the rivers meet the sky. Where the rivers meet the sky? Jake repeated. That doesn't sound like directions to a hiding place. It was something our father used to say, Emma explained. When we were children, he would take us to this special place up in the mountains, a place where two streams converged and you could see for miles in every direction. He called it where the rivers meet the sky. Marcus knew about it because Rebecca had told him stories about our childhood there. Jake felt a flicker of hope. Do you remember how to get there? Emma nodded slowly. I think so. It's up near Eagle's Peak, maybe a day's ride from here, but she looked worried. It would be dangerous to try to reach it now. The Pattersons will be looking for us, and that's a lot of open ground to cover. One problem at a time, Jake said. First, we need to get you both to safety. Then we can worry about those papers. Where would be safe? Rebecca asked. The Pattersons own half the territory. They have friends in the sheriff's office, the bank, even the territorial government. We can't trust anyone. Jake had been thinking about the same problem. The Pattersons' influence was widespread, their reach long, but there were still places they couldn't control, people they couldn't buy or intimidate. There's a settlement about 3 days' ride north of here, he said. Silver Creek. It's run by a man named Daniel Hawthorne. He used to be a judge before he retired out here. The Pattersons have no influence there because it's outside their usual territory. If we can get you to Hawthorne, he can arrange safe passage to Denver, maybe even contact the federal marshals. 3 days' ride, Rebecca mused. Through country the Pattersons know better than anyone. I know it pretty well myself, Jake said with a slight smile. And I've got advantages they don't, such as I know every line shack, every water source, every game trail between here and Silver Creek. I know which routes the Pattersons' men usually take when they're hunting rustlers or trespassers. And I know how to travel light and fast when I need to. Emma looked up from the fire, her young face serious. Why are you doing this, really? You could just point us in the right direction and wish us luck. Instead, you're talking about escorting us through dangerous country, making enemies of the most powerful family in the territory. Why? It was a fair question, and Jake took a moment to consider his answer. Why was he doing this? It would have been easier, safer, to send them on their way with some supplies and directions. But as he looked at the two sisters, Rebecca with her quiet strength and determination, Emma with her youth and courage, he knew he couldn't abandon them. I've spent the last 5 years building my ranch, he said finally, working from dawn to dusk, saving every penny, fighting drought and disease and market crashes. You know what I've learned in all that time? Both women waited for him to continue. I've learned that a man can have all the land and cattle in the world, but if he doesn't stand up for what's right when it matters, he's got nothing worth having. Jake met Rebecca's eyes, then Emma's. Your father was a good man who treated people fairly. Your husband was trying to expose corruption and protect the innocent. You two have shown more courage in one day than most people show in a lifetime. That's worth fighting for. Rebecca's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Thank you, she said quietly. I don't know how we'll ever repay you. You don't need to repay me, Jake said. Just survive. Live good lives, that'll be payment enough. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the cabin's shutters and sending snow swirling past the windows. The temperature was dropping rapidly. By morning, there would be several inches of snow on the ground, making travel more difficult, but also providing cover for their movements. We should get some rest, Jake said, rising to bank the fire. I want to be moving before dawn. The snow will help hide our tracks, but it'll also slow us down. He handed Emma an extra blanket and gestured toward the loft. You can sleep up there if you want some privacy. It's warmer than down here. I'll stay with Rebecca, Emma said, settling down beside her sister near the fire. Jake nodded and moved to the far side of the cabin where he laid out his own bedroll. He kept his rifle close and his boots on, old habits from his army days. But despite his precautions, he found himself relaxing for the first time since the confrontation in the canyon. They were safe for tonight. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. But tonight they were warm and fed and alive. It was more than he'd dared hope for when he'd first heard those screams echoing across the valley. As the fire burned low and the cabin filled with the soft sounds of sleep, Jake lay awake listening to the storm outside and planning their route to Silver Creek. 3 days through hostile territory, with the most dangerous family in Colorado hunting them, it should have been a terrifying prospect. Instead, Jake found himself looking forward to the challenge. For the first time in years, he had something more important than cattle and fences to fight for. He had 2 lives to protect, and he'd be damned if he'd let the Pattersons take them. Dawn came gray and silent, muffled by the thick blanket of snow that had fallen during the night. Jake woke to the sound of his own breathing and the subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere that told him the storm had passed. He lay still for a moment, listening to the profound quiet that only comes after a heavy snowfall, then carefully rose from his bedroll. Both sisters were still asleep near the banked fire. Emma curled against Rebecca's side like a child seeking comfort. In sleep, they looked younger, more vulnerable, and Jake felt the weight of responsibility settle even heavier on his shoulders. Today, they would begin their journey to Silver Creek, and every mile would be fraught with danger. He moved quietly to the window and peered through the frost-covered glass. The world outside had been transformed into a winter wonderland. 6 inches of fresh powder covered everything. smoothing the harsh edges of the rocky landscape and turning the scraggly mountain vegetation into something almost beautiful. But Jake's experienced eye saw beyond the scenic beauty to the tactical advantages and disadvantages the snow would bring. On the positive side, the snow would muffle the sound of their horses' hooves and make tracking more difficult once the wind picked up and began drifting the powder. On the negative side, it would slow their progress considerably and leave a clear trail for anyone persistent enough to follow. Jake started coffee quietly, the familiar ritual helping him think through their options. The direct route to Silver Creek would take them through Copper Canyon and across the high meadows beyond, exposed ground where they could be spotted from miles away. But there was another way, longer and more treacherous, that followed the old mining trails through the deep woods. It would add at least a day to their journey, but it would keep them hidden. "You're up early." Rebecca's voice came softly from behind him. Jake turned to find her sitting up by the fire, her auburn hair mussed from sleep, but her green eyes alert. She'd wrapped one of the blankets around her shoulders like a shawl, and in the dim morning light, she looked like some pioneer woman from a daguerreotype. "Habit," Jake said, pouring coffee into a second tin cup and offering it to her. "Dawn's the best time to move in country like this. Most folks are still asleep, and the light's tricky enough that it's hard to judge distances." Rebecca accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm metal. "How far did we get from them yesterday, do you think?" "Far enough that they won't find us here," Jake said, "but not far enough that we can relax. The Pattersons will have men out looking as soon as the snow stops falling. They'll check every line shack, every cabin, every place someone might hole up." As if summoned by their conversation, Emma stirred and sat up, blinking in the firelight. Her young face was creased from sleep, but Jake could see the fear lurking just beneath the surface, the fear of someone who'd learned too young that the world could be a cruel and dangerous place. "Morning," she said quietly, accepting coffee from Jake with a shy nod of thanks. "How are you feeling?" Rebecca asked, reaching over to smooth her sister's hair with the automatic gesture of someone who'd been caring for others her whole life. "Better," Emma said, and Jake was pleased to hear that her voice was stronger than it had been the night before. More rested anyway. "What's the plan for today?" Jake spread his rough map on the table, weighing down the corners with tin cups. The map was hand-drawn, based on years of riding these mountains, and it showed details that wouldn't appear on any official survey: water sources, game trails, abandoned mines, places where a man could hide or make a stand if necessary. "We've got two choices," he said, tracing the routes with his finger. "Fast and dangerous, or slow and hidden. The direct route to Silver Creek goes through open country, where we could be spotted easily, but we'd be there by tomorrow night. The indirect route keeps us in heavy forest most of the way, but it'll take us 3 days, maybe 4 with the snow." Rebecca studied the map, her brow furrowed in concentration. "What do you recommend?" "Normally, I'd say take the hidden route. Better to arrive late than not at all." Jake's expression grew troubled. "But there's something I haven't told you yet. Something I heard in town last week that changes things." Both sisters looked at him expectantly. "There's talk that the territorial governor is planning to visit this area next month, looking into complaints about land disputes and corruption. If word of that has reached the Pattersons, and knowing their connections, it probably has, they'll be desperate to tie up loose ends before the investigation starts." "Meaning us," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Meaning you," Jake confirmed grimly. "They can't afford to let you reach the authorities, especially if you have access to those papers Marcus hid. They'll pull out all the stops to find you, and they'll do it fast." Rebecca set down her coffee cup, her hand trembling slightly. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying we take the fast route. We run hard for Silver Creek and hope we can stay ahead of them long enough to reach safety." The next hour was spent in preparation. Jake packed supplies into saddlebags: dried meat, hardtack, coffee, and ammunition. He cleaned and loaded his rifle and pistol, then handed Rebecca a small derringer he'd kept in the cabin's supply chest. "Do you know how to use this?" he asked. Rebecca nodded, checking the weapon with practiced ease. My father taught both Emma and me to shoot. He said a woman on the frontier needed to be able to protect herself. Smart man, Jake said approvingly. He turned to Emma. What about you? I can shoot, Emma said, though she looked uncomfortable with the idea. I've never shot at a person before. Hopefully you won't have to today either, Jake said gently. But if it comes down to your life or theirs, don't hesitate. The Pattersons sure won't. By the time the sun had cleared the eastern peaks, they were mounted and ready to move. Jake had saddled 2 of the horses he kept at the line shack, sturdy mountain ponies bred for this kind of terrain, while Thunder carried the supplies. The snow had stopped falling, but the sky remained overcast, promising more weather to come. They set out through the timber, following deer trails and old logging roads that wound through the dense forest of pine and aspen. The snow muffled their horses' footfalls, and the thick canopy overhead would make them invisible from above, but Jake remained alert for any sign of pursuit. For the first few miles, they made good progress. The trail was clear enough to follow, and the horses were sure-footed despite the snow. Rebecca and Emma rode well, he noticed. They sat their mounts with confidence and moved with the rhythm of the horses instead of fighting it. It was Emma who first spotted the smoke. There, she said, pointing to a thin grey column rising above the trees about 2 miles to their south. Is that a campfire? Jake studied the smoke through his field glasses, his jaw tightening as he took in the details. Not a campfire. That's from a cabin chimney, and it's too much smoke for just 1 or 2 people. He lowered the glasses, his expression grim. That's the old Hartley place. Been abandoned for years, but it looks like someone's using it now. The Pattersons? Rebecca asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Has to be. They're setting up a search base, probably coordinating their men from there. Jake studied the map again, calculating distances and routes. The good news is, we're still ahead of them. The bad news is, they're organized and they know these mountains almost as well as I do. They pushed on, but Jake could feel the tension ratcheting up with every mile. The snow that had seemed like such an advantage that morning was now working against them. Their trail was clear as daylight to anyone who knew how to read sign, and the cold was beginning to affect the horses. It was just after noon when they heard the first dogs. The sound came from behind them, faint but unmistakable, the deep baying of hunting hounds on a scent trail. Jake's blood ran cold. He'd been expecting mounted pursuit, maybe a few men with rifles. He hadn't counted on tracking dogs. How much of a lead do we have? Rebecca asked, her face pale but her voice steady. Jake listened to the baying, using his experience to judge distance and direction. Maybe an hour, maybe less, and the dogs will move faster through this snow than we can. Emma's mount danced nervously, picking up on her rider's fear. What do we do? Jake was already turning Thunder toward a side trail that led up the mountainside. We changed the game. Follow me and stay close. We're going up. The trail they now followed was little more than a game path, narrow and treacherous, winding up the steep slope through stands of pine and over exposed rock faces. The horses labored in the thin air and deep snow, their breath steaming in the cold mountain atmosphere. Behind them, the baying of the hounds grew closer. There! Emma pointed ahead to a dark opening in the rock face. Is that a cave? Jake nodded grimly. All mine shaft. We can't outrun dogs, but we might be able to outthink them. He dismounted and led Thunder into the dark opening, gesturing for the women to follow. Get the horses inside quickly. The mine shaft was larger than it appeared from outside, opening into a natural cavern that had been expanded by long-dead miners seeking silver or gold. It was cold and damp, but it was shelter, and more importantly, it was defensible. Jake worked quickly, gathering dry wood from the back of the cave and building a small fire near the entrance. The smoke would dissipate before it reached the opening, he hoped, and the warmth would help counter the numbing cold. Why are we stopping? Emma asked, her voice tight with fear as the sound of the approaching dogs grew louder. Because running isn't going to save us, Jake said, checking his rifle. The dogs are faster than our horses in this snow, and they'll run us to ground eventually. Better to make our stand here, where we have the advantage of position. Rebecca moved to the cave entrance, peering out through the snow-laden trees. "How many do you think there are?" "Hard to say. At least 4 or 5 men, plus the dogs." Jake positioned himself where he could see the trail they'd just climbed. "But they'll have to come up single file, and that evens the odds considerably." The next 20 minutes passed with agonizing slowness. The baying of the hounds grew steadily closer, and eventually they could hear the shouts of men and the sound of horses struggling up the steep trail. Jake felt the familiar calm that came over him in moments of crisis. His breathing slowed, his vision sharpened, and his mind cleared of everything except the tactical situation at hand. "Remember," he said quietly to the sisters, "wait for my signal. Don't shoot unless you're sure of your target, and don't waste ammunition. We don't have much to spare." The first dog appeared at the tree line below, a massive bloodhound with its nose to the ground and its tail high. It was followed by a second, then a third. Behind them came the riders, 4 men Jake recognized as Patterson hired guns, led by someone he couldn't quite make out through the falling snow. The dogs lost the scent at the rock face, milling around in confusion as they tried to pick up the trail that had vanished into stone. The riders dismounted, spreading out to search the area, their rifles ready. "They went up here somewhere," one of the men called out. "Dogs say so anyway." "Spread out," came the reply from the leader. "Check every cave, every overhang. They can't have gone far." Jake waited until the men were scattered across the slope below, then took careful aim at the nearest rider. The shot echoed off the mountain peaks like thunder, and the man spun around and fell, clutching his shoulder. Chaos erupted on the mountainside. The remaining men dove for cover behind trees and rocks, shouting orders and trying to locate the source of the gunfire. The dogs, spooked by the shot, milled around, barking and howling. "There! In the mine shaft!" one of the men yelled, pointing directly at their hiding place. Bullets began to strike the rock around the cave entrance, sending chips of stone flying. Jake fired again, keeping the attackers pinned down while he tried to count their numbers and positions. "Can you see the leader?" Rebecca asked, crouching beside him with her derringer ready. Jake squinted through the snow and gun smoke. "Yeah, I can see him now." His blood ran cold as he recognized the figure directing the attack from behind a large boulder. It's Jeremiah Patterson himself. The patriarch of the Patterson family was older than his sons, but no less dangerous. If anything, he was more cunning, more ruthless. And if he was here personally, it meant the Pattersons considered this matter important enough to risk everything. "He won't give up," Rebecca said, stating what they all knew. "He can't afford to let us live." "Then we'd better make sure we don't give him the choice," Jake replied, steadying his rifle for another shot. The battle for the mine shaft was just beginning, and Jake knew their survival would depend not just on their shooting skills, but on their ability to outthink one of the most dangerous men in the territory. Outside, the snow began to fall again, and Jeremiah Patterson's voice carried clearly through the cold mountain air. "Morrison! You've got nowhere to run now. Send out the women and maybe I'll let you live long. Enough to regret crossing my family." Jake's response was another rifle shot that sent the old man diving for cover. The war had begun in earnest. The mine shaft had become a fortress carved from living rock. But Jake knew that fortresses could become tombs if the defenders weren't careful. As bullets continued to ping off the stone entrance and ricochet into the darkness behind them, he assessed their situation with the cold pragmatism of a man who'd seen too many battles. They had advantages: high ground, solid cover, and limited approaches the enemy could use. But they also had critical weaknesses: limited ammunition, no food except what was in Jake's saddlebags, and horses that were growing increasingly agitated by the gunfire echoing through the confined space. "How long can we hold them off?" Emma asked, her voice steady despite the fear Jake could see in her eyes. The girl had more steel in her than many grown men he'd known. "Depends on what Jeremiah's willing to sacrifice," Jake replied, carefully aiming at a muzzle flash from below. "He's got us pinned, but every minute he spends up here is another minute the territorial governor's investigation gets closer." Rebecca crawled to the cave entrance beside him, keeping low to avoid stray bullets. What if we tried to negotiate? Maybe if I agreed to go with them, they'd let you and Emma go free. No, Jake said firmly, not taking his eyes off the slope below. First, they'll never let any of us live now. We know too much. Second, I didn't risk my neck to save you just to hand you over the first time things got difficult. Emma's voice came from deeper in the cave, where she was trying to calm the horses. Besides, Rebecca, you heard what Marcus told me. The evidence is hidden where the rivers meet the sky. If anything happens to me, that secret dies too. A new voice echoed up from the mountainside, harsh and commanding. It was Jeremiah Patterson himself, no longer hiding behind his men, but standing partially exposed on a rocky outcrop about 100 yards down the slope. "Morrison," the old man shouted, "you're a practical man. Let's discuss this like reasonable people." Jake didn't respond immediately, instead studying the Patterson patriarch through his rifle sights. Jeremiah was in his 60s, but still powerfully built, with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that came from decades of getting his way through force and intimidation. He wore an expensive coat and boots, but he carried himself like a man comfortable with violence. What's to discuss? Jake called back, keeping his rifle trained on the older man. "Your future," Jeremiah replied. "Right now you're a kidnapper and a murderer in the eyes of the law. But I'm a reasonable man. Return my daughter-in-law and her sister, and I'll make sure the charges disappear. You can go back to your cattle and your quiet life." Jake almost laughed at the audacity of it. "Daughter-in-law? Last I heard, Rebecca was a widow whose husband died in a convenient accident." "Accidents happen," Jeremiah said with a shrug that was visible even at a distance. "Marcus was always careless around horses. But family takes care of family, and Rebecca is family. As is young Emma. Funny way of taking care of family," Jake shot back. "Tying them up and leaving them for the coyotes. That was an unfortunate misunderstanding," Jeremiah replied smoothly. "My sons acted hastily. I've spoken to them about it." Rebecca had heard enough. She moved to the cave entrance, staying in cover but raising her voice so it would carry down the mountain. "You killed my husband, Jeremiah. And you would have killed us both if Jake hadn't stopped you." "Now, Rebecca!" Jeremiah's voice took on a paternal tone that made Jake's skin crawl. "You're distraught, grieving. You're not thinking clearly. Come down here and we'll discuss this properly, as family should." "I'm thinking clearly enough to know a murderer when I see one," Rebecca shouted back. "And I know what Marcus found in your study. All of it." There was a long pause from below. When Jeremiah spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of warmth. "I see. In that case, I'm afraid this conversation is over." The old man disappeared behind the rocks, and moments later the gunfire resumed with renewed intensity. But this time it was different, more coordinated, more systematic. Jake recognized the pattern immediately. "They're moving," he told the sisters. "Jeremiah's sending men around to flank us." Through the swirling snow, Jake could see the Patterson men spreading out, trying to find alternative routes up the mountainside. The mine shaft's entrance faced south, which gave them a good view of the main approach. But there were gullies and rock formations that could provide cover for a determined assault. "How many rounds do we have left?" Rebecca asked, checking her derringer. Jake did a quick inventory. "Maybe 20 for the rifle, a dozen for my pistol." "You?" "2 shots," Rebecca said. "This little gun doesn't hold much." It wasn't enough for a prolonged siege, and they all knew it. Jake's mind raced through their options. They could try to slip out the back of the cave. Many of these old mine shafts connected to natural cave systems that honeycombed the mountain. But they'd have to leave the horses behind, and traveling on foot through this snow would be suicide. That's when Emma spoke up from the back of the cave. "There's another way out." Both Jake and Rebecca turned to look at her. The young woman was standing beside what looked like a solid wall of rock. But as Jake moved closer, he could see that it was actually a narrow opening, impartially concealed by fallen stones and mineral deposits. "I was exploring while you were watching the entrance," Emma explained. "This goes back pretty far, and I can feel air moving through it. There might be another exit." Jake grabbed a burning branch from their fire and held it up to the opening. The flame flickered in a definite breeze. "You're right. This connects to something. He turned back to the entrance, where muzzle flashes were getting closer. How far back does it go? I don't know. I didn't want to go too far without telling you. A new sound reached them from outside, the scrape of boots on stone, coming from above and to their left. The flanking party had found a way up. Decision time, Jake said grimly. We can make our stand here and probably get overrun in the next 10 minutes, or we can take our chances with that tunnel. What about the horses? Rebecca asked. Jake looked at Thunder and the 2 mountain ponies. Leaving them behind felt like abandoning friends, but trying to take them through an unknown cave system would be impossible. We'll have to leave them, he said. But horses are smart. They'll find their way out of these mountains. Quickly they gathered what supplies they could carry. Jake slung his rifle across his back and tucked his pistol into his belt. Rebecca checked her derringer one more time, then tucked it into the pocket of her coat. Emma packed what little food they had left into a cloth sack. The sounds of approaching men were getting closer. Jake could hear voices now, coordinating the final assault. Go, he told Emma, gesturing toward the narrow opening. You first, then Rebecca. I'll cover our retreat. Emma squeezed through the gap, her slender form disappearing into the darkness beyond. Rebecca followed, pausing only to press Jake's hand briefly before vanishing into the tunnel. Jake took one last look around the mine shaft that had sheltered them. The fire was burning low, casting dancing shadows on the rough walls. The horses stood quietly, as if they sensed the gravity of the moment. Thunder looked at him with intelligent brown eyes, and Jake felt his throat tighten. Take care of yourself, old friend, he whispered, then turned and squeezed through the opening just as the first Patterson man appeared at the cave entrance. The tunnel beyond was narrow and winding, barely wide enough for a single person. Jake followed the flickering light of Emma's makeshift torch, his shoulders scraping against the rough stone walls. Behind them, he could hear shouts and curses as the Patterson men discovered their escape route. They're gone, someone yelled. There's a tunnel back here. Follow them. That was Jeremiah's voice, harsh with anger. I want them found. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, sometimes opening into larger chambers, sometimes narrowing to gaps they had to crawl through. The air was cold and damp, with that mineral smell that spoke of deep earth and ancient stone. Emma's torch was burning low, and they had no way to replace it once it died. How are we doing for air? Jake called softly to Emma, who was still leading the way. Still moving, she replied. But I think we're going deeper, not up toward another exit. That was troubling. Jake had hoped they were moving through a natural cave system that would eventually connect to another opening on the mountainside. But if they were going deeper, a new sound reached them from ahead, the unmistakable sound of running water. There's something up here, Emma called back. A bigger chamber. They emerged into a natural cavern, perhaps 30 feet across, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above them. Along one wall, an underground stream bubbled up from deep in the mountain and flowed across the chamber, before disappearing into another tunnel. Which way? Rebecca asked, looking at the multiple passages that led off from the chamber. Jake studied the air currents, holding up the dying torch to see which way the flames bent. There, he said, pointing to a passage that angled upward. That one's drawing air. But before they could move toward it, new light appeared in the tunnel they'd just left. Torchlight moving toward them. They're following us, Emma whispered. Jake nodded grimly. The Patterson men had been smarter than he'd hoped, bringing their own torches and pursuing them into the mountain's depths. And in these narrow confines, superior numbers would matter even more than they had in the mine shaft. The stream, Rebecca said suddenly. If we follow it downstream, we might find another way out. And the water will hide our tracks. It was risky. The stream might lead deeper into the mountain or end in an underground lake with no exit. But with the Patterson men closing in, they didn't have many choices. Do it, Jake said. They waded into the stream, the icy water shocking even through their boots. The current was stronger than it looked, and the rocks beneath their feet were slippery with algae and mineral deposits. But the stream did lead somewhere. Jake could feel the air moving across the water. Behind them, voices echoed through the cavern as their pursuers reached the chamber. 3 passages, someone called out. Which way? Split up, came Jeremiah's voice. Cover all 3. And remember, I want them alive if possible, but don't let them escape. Jake, Rebecca, and Emma pressed on through the underground river, the sound of their passage masked by the gurgling water. The ceiling above them seemed to be getting lower, and Jake began to worry that they were heading into a dead end. But then, impossibly, he saw something that made his heart leap. A faint grey light ahead, so dim he almost thought he was imagining it. There, he whispered to the sisters. Natural light. They struggled forward through the deepening water, fighting the current that seemed determined to sweep them back toward their pursuers. The light grew stronger, and Jake realized they were approaching another cave entrance, this one opening onto the mountainside, somewhere far from where they'd started. We made it. Emma breathed as they reached the opening, but as they prepared to exit the cave, Jake held up a hand. Something was wrong. The light wasn't just coming from outside. There were torch flames out there, and the shadows of men moving across the entrance. They'd walked directly into another trap. Jeremiah Patterson's voice echoed from the cave mouth, tinged with dark satisfaction. Did you really think I didn't know these mountains, Morrison? Every cave, every passage, every way in and out. Welcome to the end of the line. Standing waist-deep in icy water at the mouth of the cave, Jake felt the walls of their situation closing in like the stone passages behind them. Jeremiah Patterson's silhouette blocked the cave entrance, flanked by armed men whose torches turned the falling snow into a dancing curtain of orange light. The old man's voice carried the satisfaction of a predator who'd finally cornered his prey. 30 years I've been exploring these mountains, Jeremiah called into the cave. Every mining claim, every natural formation, every rabbit hole that goes deeper than a man's arm. Did you think you could hide from me in my own backyard? Jake's mind raced through possibilities. Behind them, more torchlights were approaching through the tunnel, the men who'd been following their trail. Ahead, Jeremiah and his guards controlled the only exit. The underground river offered no escape. It disappeared into solid rock just beyond where they stood. But as Jake studied the cave mouth, something nagged at his military-trained eye. The positioning was wrong. Jeremiah stood confidently in the open, his men spread too wide, their attention focused inward on the cave rather than outward on potential threats. For all his talk of knowing these mountains, the old man was making tactical errors. Last chance, Morrison, Jeremiah continued. Send out the women and I'll make your death quick. Keep fighting, and I'll make sure you watch them suffer first. That's when Emma did something that surprised everyone, including Jake and Rebecca. Instead of shrinking back in fear, she stepped forward in the water, her young voice carrying clearly through the cave opening. You want us, Jeremiah? Then come and get us yourself. Stop hiding behind your hired guns like the coward you are. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Jeremiah's face darkened with rage, and he took several steps into the cave, his hand moving to the pistol at his hip. You little... His words were cut off by a sound that made Jake's heart surge with hope, the thunderous crack of rifle fire from outside the cave, followed by shouts of alarm and confusion. We're under attack! One of Patterson's men yelled. Riders coming up from the valley! Jake recognized the voice that answered from somewhere in the darkness, beyond the torchlight. Sheriff Tom Hendricks, a gruff but honest lawman who'd been one of the few officials in the territory the Pattersons couldn't buy or intimidate. Jeremiah Patterson, Hendricks bellowed. This is the territorial sheriff. You're surrounded! Drop your weapons and come out with your hands visible. The old man's face went through a rapid series of expressions, surprise, calculation, and finally cold fury. He'd been outmaneuvered, but he wasn't the type to surrender gracefully. How? He snarled, looking back toward his men, who were scrambling for defensive positions. How did they know? Jake allowed himself a grim smile. Maybe because there are still some honest folks in this territory. Folks who notice when too many men with guns start riding toward the same mountain. What Jake didn't say, what he was only beginning to piece together himself, was that Sheriff Hendricks had probably been watching the Patterson operations for weeks, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. The territorial governor's planned investigation had likely put every honest lawman on high alert. Outside the cave, the gunfight was heating up. Jake could hear the sharp crack of rifle fire echoing off the mountain walls, punctuated by shouted orders and the nervous whinnying of horses. But inside the cave, Jeremiah still had the advantage of position and hostages. "Sheriff or no sheriff," the old man growled, drawing his pistol and aiming it directly at Rebecca. "Nobody's leaving this cave alive. If I can't have what I want, then neither can anyone else." That's when the mountain itself seemed to intervene. Jake had felt it first as a subtle vibration through the soles of his boots, transmitted through the stone and water. Then came a low, rumbling sound, so deep it was felt more than heard. The torch flames flickered, and loose stones began to rattle in the cave walls. "What?" Jeremiah began, but his words were lost as the rumbling grew louder. Jake knew what was happening. He'd felt it before, during his years in these mountains. The combination of melting snow, underground water pressure, and the vibrations from all the gunfire had triggered something that was both beautiful and terrifying, a spring avalanche. "Everyone down!" Jake shouted, grabbing both sisters and pulling them deeper into the cave as the first wave of sound hit. The avalanche started high on the peak above them, thousands of tons of snow and ice that had been held in precarious balance, finally giving way to gravity and physics. The sound was indescribable, like the voice of an angry god, a roar that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. Through the cave entrance, Jake caught a glimpse of Jeremiah's face, no longer confident but suddenly terrified as he realized what was happening. The old man turned to run, but there was nowhere to go fast enough. The wall of snow hit the mountainside like a white tsunami, burying everything in its path. Trees that had stood for centuries were snapped like matchsticks. Boulders the size of houses were tossed aside like pebbles, and the men who had been fighting outside the cave simply disappeared, swallowed by the avalanche as if they had never existed. The cave shook like a living thing as the avalanche passed overhead, but the ancient stone held firm. Jake pressed himself against Rebecca and Emma, shielding them with his body as rocks fell from the ceiling and the underground river surged with meltwater and debris. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of settling snow and the trickle of water finding new channels through the debris. Jake cautiously raised his head, ears ringing from the tremendous noise. The cave entrance was completely blocked, not just covered, but sealed behind tons of compacted snow and ice. They were buried alive, but they were also safe from pursuit. Assuming they could find another way out before their air ran out. "Is everyone all right?" Jake asked, helping the sisters to their feet. Rebecca nodded shakily, brushing stone dust from her hair. "I think so, Emma." The younger woman was pale but steady. "I'm fine. But what about the sheriff and his men? What about—" She didn't finish the sentence, but they all knew what she was asking. "What about Jeremiah and his hired guns? Had they been caught in the avalanche?" "There's no way to know right now," Jake said honestly. "But if they were outside when it hit—" He shrugged grimly. "The mountain doesn't take sides, but it doesn't show mercy either. They stood in the darkness. Their makeshift torch had been extinguished by falling debris, listening to the sounds of the mountain settling around them. Water dripped steadily from somewhere overhead, and Jake could feel air movement that suggested other passages, other ways through the underground maze. So what now?" Rebecca asked quietly. "We can't go back the way we came, and we can't go out the way we came in." Jake was already exploring by touch, feeling along the cave walls for other openings. "There has to be another way. These cave systems are like underground highways. They connect to each other in ways that don't always make sense from the surface." Emma's voice came from deeper in the darkness. "I think I found something. There's definitely air moving through here." They made their way carefully toward her voice, hands extended to avoid obstacles. What Emma had found was a natural chimney in the rock, angling upward at a steep but climbable angle. Cold air flowed down from above, carrying with it the scent of pine trees and fresh snow. "It goes up," Emma reported. "Way up. But I can see light at the top. Just a glimmer, but it's there. Jake tested the handholds, feeling for loose rock that might give way under their weight. The stone was solid, worn smooth by centuries of water flow, but still rough enough to provide grip. "It'll be a hard climb," he warned, "and we don't know what we'll find at the top. But it's better than sitting here waiting for the air to run out." They began the ascent slowly, Jake leading the way to test each handhold before the sisters followed. The chimney was just wide enough for one person at a time, with natural ledges every 10 or 15 feet where they could rest and catch their breath. As they climbed higher, the light from above grew stronger, and Jake began to hear something that made his heart lift, the sound of wind through trees, and underneath it, human voices calling out in the distance. "Hello," he shouted upward, his voice echoing in the narrow space. "Is anyone up there?" The response came back immediately. Sheriff Hendricks's gruff voice carried down the stone chimney. "Morrison, is that you? Are the women with you?" "We're all here," Jake called back. "But we're going to need help getting out." It took another hour of careful climbing before they reached the top of the chimney, which opened into a small depression on the mountainside, about half a mile from where they'd entered the cave system. Sheriff Hendricks and 2 of his deputies were waiting with ropes and warm blankets. As they were pulled to safety, Jake got his first look at what the avalanche had done. The entire face of the mountain had been reshaped, trees and boulders scattered like toys. Where Jeremiah Patterson and his men had been standing, there was nothing but a pristine field of white snow. "Any sign of survivors?" Jake asked, as Hendricks wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. The sheriff shook his head grimly. "We pulled 3 men out alive from the edges of the slide, but they're in no shape to cause trouble. As for Jeremiah," he gestured toward the massive pile of debris, "we'll keep looking," but he didn't need to finish. They all understood that the mountain had rendered its own verdict on Jeremiah Patterson and his crimes. Emma sat on a fallen log, looking out over the transformed landscape. "It's over, isn't it?" she said quietly. "Really over?" Rebecca moved to sit beside her sister, putting an arm around the younger woman's shoulders. "Not quite," she said. "We still need to find those papers Marcus hid. We still need to make sure the truth comes out about everything the Pattersons did." Jake nodded, thinking about the cryptic clue Marcus had left. "Where the rivers meet the sky." With Emma's help, they might finally be able to uncover the evidence that would expose the full extent of the Patterson corruption. Sheriff Hendricks approached them, his expression serious but hopeful. "Ladies, I'm going to need you to come back to town with me. There are going to be a lot of questions and a lot of statements to take. But I want you to know you're under my protection now. What's left of the Patterson organization won't be troubling you again." As they prepared to leave the mountain, Jake took one last look back at the cave entrance that had saved their lives. Somewhere in the darkness below, Thunder and the other horses were hopefully finding their way to safety. Somewhere in the snow above, the remains of their enemies lay buried under tons of ice and stone. The mountain had chosen its side after all, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, Jake Morrison allowed himself to believe that they might actually have a chance at justice, safety, and something that had been missing from his life for far too long, hope for the future. 3 days after the avalanche, the town of Pine Ridge buzzed with the kind of nervous energy that comes when the established order suddenly crumbles. Word had spread quickly that Jeremiah Patterson was missing and presumed dead, along with most of his inner circle. The Patterson empire, built on intimidation and corruption over 3 decades, was beginning to collapse like a house of cards in a strong wind. Jake Morrison sat in Sheriff Hendrick's office, watching through the window as townspeople gathered in small groups on the street corners, their conversations animated and urgent. Some looked relieved, others worried about what would come next. The Pattersons had been tyrants, but they'd also been the largest employers in the territory. "The territorial governor's investigators arrived this morning," Sheriff Hendricks said, settling his substantial frame into the chair behind his desk. They're already asking hard questions about the Patterson land acquisitions, the railroad contracts, the banking arrangements. Without Jeremiah to intimidate witnesses, people are starting to talk. Rebecca looked up from the statement she'd been writing. Her hand cramped from hours of documenting everything she could remember about Marcus's discoveries and the family's threats. Will it be enough? The investigators, can they prove what the Pattersons did without the papers Marcus hid? Hendricks shrugged. Maybe. Probably. But those documents would make the case airtight. They'd ensure that every crime is exposed, every victim compensated, every accomplice brought to justice. Emma had been quiet since they'd returned to town, processing everything that had happened. Now she spoke up, her voice thoughtful. I've been thinking about what Marcus said. Where the rivers meet the sky. I know Father used to take us to Eagle's Peak when we were children, but I'm wondering if there was somewhere else. Somewhere more specific to Marcus. Jake leaned forward in his chair. What do you mean? Marcus was an educated man, Emma continued. He went to college back east, studied literature and philosophy. When he said where the rivers meet the sky, he might not have meant it literally. He might have been speaking metaphorically. Rebecca set down her pen, interested. What kind of metaphor? Emma stood and moved to the window, looking out at the bustling street. What if rivers doesn't mean water? What if it means streams of information, lines of communication, and sky could mean heaven? Or more practically, the highest point of something. Jake felt a spark of understanding. The church bell tower. It's the highest point in town, and it's where all the streams of information come together. The church records, the meeting minutes, the library. Rebecca interrupted, her eyes lighting up with realization. Marcus donated money to build the church library last year. He said it was important for the community to have access to knowledge and information. He spent weeks working with the pastor to design the layout, to decide what books to include. Sheriff Hendricks was already reaching for his hat. Father O'Brien's been out of town for a week, visiting his sister in Denver. But I've got keys to the church. The four of them made their way through Pine Ridge's main street, past the curious stares of townspeople who recognized the sisters as the women at the center of the recent drama. The church sat on a small hill at the north end of town, its white steeple piercing the blue Colorado sky like a finger pointing toward heaven. Inside, the church was cool and quiet, filled with the smell of old wood and lingering incense. The library occupied a small room behind the altar, lined with shelves that held perhaps 200 books, an impressive collection for a frontier town. If Marcus hid something here, Jake said, studying the room, where would he put it? Somewhere safe, but somewhere Emma could find it if she needed to. Emma walked slowly along the shelves, running her fingers over the book spines. Most were religious texts, but there were also volumes of poetry, philosophy, and history. She paused at a section that contained works by authors she recognized from her own education. Here, she said softly, pulling out a leather-bound volume. The Rose Walden. Father read this to us when we were children. He said it was about finding truth in nature, about the importance of living deliberately. She opened the book carefully, and immediately they could see that pages had been carefully cut out from the center, creating a hollow space. Inside that space was a small oilskin packet tied with string. Is that... Rebecca began. Emma nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she untied the string. Inside the oilskin were folded papers, covered with Marcus's neat handwriting, and what appeared to be copies of official documents, land deeds, railroad contracts, bank records, and correspondence. Sheriff Hendricks spread the papers out on the library table, his expression growing grimmer as he read. "Dear God," he muttered, "this is worse than we thought." Jake looked over the sheriff's shoulder at one of the documents. It appeared to be a contract between Jeremiah Patterson and a railroad company, but the terms were clearly fraudulent. Patterson was claiming ownership of land he'd never legally acquired, and the railroad was paying him prices far above market value for right-of-way access. "Look at this," Rebecca said, holding up what appeared to be a bank ledger. They were laundering money through fake cattle sales. buying herds that didn't exist, selling them to buyers who didn't exist, all to justify moving stolen funds through the banking system. Emma had found something even more disturbing, a series of letters between Jeremiah Patterson and various territorial officials, including a judge and 2 territorial senators. The correspondence made it clear that these officials were receiving regular payments in exchange for favorable rulings and legislation. "This isn't just local corruption," Sheriff Hendricks said, his voice heavy with the implications. "This reaches all the way to the territorial capital, maybe even to Washington." The Patterson organization was essentially running a shadow government, but it was the final document that made them all go silent. It was Marcus Patterson's own handwritten account of his father's crimes, including a detailed confession of how he'd learned about his family's activities and his growing horror at what he'd discovered. "Listen to this," Rebecca said, reading from Marcus's confession. "I tried to confront my father about what I'd found, to convince him to make restitution and turn himself in to the authorities. His response was to threaten not only me, but Rebecca and her family. He said that anyone who stood in the way of the Patterson legacy would be eliminated, and that accidents could be arranged for anyone who became inconvenient." Jake felt cold anger building in his chest. He knew they were going to kill him, and he knew they'd come after us next, Emma added quietly. "That's why he hid these papers. He wanted to make sure the truth would survive, even if he didn't." Sheriff Hendricks was already gathering up the documents. "I need to get these to the territorial investigators immediately. This evidence will not only expose the Patterson crimes, but it'll also implicate every official who was taking bribes. This could bring down half the territorial government." As they prepared to leave the church, Emma lingered for a moment, looking back at the book that had concealed Marcus's final act of courage. "He really loved you," she said to Rebecca. "Everything he did, all the risks he took, it was to protect you and to make sure justice was done." Rebecca nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I know. And now we can make sure he didn't die for nothing." Outside the church, they found that news of their discovery had somehow already begun to spread. A crowd had gathered in the street, and Jake could see men on horseback riding hard toward the telegraph office. Word would reach the territorial capital within hours. But not everyone in the crowd looked pleased by these developments. Jake spotted several men he recognized as Patterson employees and allies, their faces dark with worry and anger. The collapse of the Patterson Empire would affect many people, and not all of them would go quietly. "Sheriff," one of these men called out as they descended the church steps. "Is it true? Are you saying Mr. Patterson was a criminal?" Hendricks faced the crowd squarely. "I'm saying that we've uncovered evidence of serious crimes, and that justice will be served. Anyone who was knowingly involved in illegal activities needs to come forward now, before the territorial investigators start making arrests." "And what about our jobs?" another man demanded. "The Patterson Ranch employs half this county. If you destroy the family, you destroy the whole economy." It was Rebecca who answered, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "The Patterson wealth was built on stolen land and illegal contracts. The people who really own that land, the small ranchers and farmers who were cheated out of their property, they'll get it back. The economy will be stronger when it's based on honest work instead of corruption." The crowd's mood was mixed, some people nodding in agreement, others muttering angrily among themselves. Jake could sense the potential for violence in the air, the desperation of people who saw their world changing and didn't know if they'd have a place in whatever came next. That's when a new voice cut through the tension. "Sheriff Hendricks is right. It's time for the truth to come out." Everyone turned to see who had spoken. It was Thomas Patterson, Jeremiah's middle son, and the only surviving member of the immediate family. He sat on horseback at the edge of the crowd, his face haggard but determined. "Thomas?" Sheriff Hendricks said, surprised. "I thought you were missing with the others." "I was in Denver when it happened," Thomas replied, dismounting and walking toward them. I came back as soon as I heard about the avalanche. He looked directly at Rebecca and Emma. Ladies, I owe you an apology. I owe this whole community an apology. Jake studied the man carefully. Thomas Patterson had always been the quietest of Jeremiah's sons, content to manage the family's legitimate business interests while staying out of the darker aspects of the operation. But his presence here now could mean either redemption or another trap. I know what my family did, Thomas continued, his voice carrying to every person in the crowd. I knew about some of it, suspected more of it, and did nothing to stop it. That makes me complicit, and I'll face whatever consequences the law demands. He pulled a thick envelope from his coat. But I can also help make things right. These are the deeds to properties my father claimed illegally, along with bank records showing where the stolen money went. I want to cooperate fully with the investigation, and I want to help return stolen property to its rightful owners. The crowd was silent, processing this unexpected development. Emma stepped forward, her young face serious but not unkind. Why? She asked simply. Why help us now? Thomas looked at her for a long moment before answering. Because Marcus was my brother, and he was a good man. Because you two almost died trying to expose the truth he discovered. And because, he paused, his voice breaking slightly, because I have children of my own, and I want them to grow up in a world where justice matters more than power. Sheriff Hendricks took the envelope, adding it to the other evidence they'd gathered. This will make a significant difference in the investigation, and in making restitution to the victims. As the crowd began to disperse, people heading home to process everything they'd learned, Jake found himself walking beside Rebecca and Emma toward the hotel where they'd been staying. It's really over, isn't it? Emma said, looking back at the church where they'd found the hidden truth. The immediate danger is over, Jake replied carefully. But there's still a lot of work ahead. Trials, investigations, figuring out how to rebuild the economy on honest foundations. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, then asked the question that had been weighing on all their minds. What happens now? To us, I mean. Emma and I have no home to go back to, no business to run. Everything we had was tied up with the Patterson interests. Jake stopped walking and turned to face both sisters. I've been thinking about that, he said. My ranch is profitable, but it's more land than one man needs. I could use partners, people who understand business, who can help build something honest and lasting. Emma's eyes widened. You're offering us a partnership? I'm offering you a chance to start over, Jake said. All of us together, building something good on land that's been paid for honestly, with profits that come from hard work instead of corruption. Rebecca looked at her sister, then back at Jake. You've already saved our lives twice. You don't owe us anything more? Maybe not, Jake agreed. But maybe I'm not doing this because I owe you something. Maybe I'm doing it because I want to. As they stood there in the fading afternoon light, with the church steeple rising behind them and the vast Colorado sky stretching endlessly overhead, Jake Morrison realized that his life had changed in ways he'd never expected. He'd started this journey as a lonely rancher, trying to help two women in distress. Now he was part of something larger, a family of choice, bound together by shared trials and common hopes for the future. The rivers had indeed met the sky, and from that meeting, something new and precious had been born. 6 weeks after the avalanche that had reshaped both the mountain and the future of Pine Ridge, Rebecca Collins stood in the main courtroom of the Territorial Courthouse in Denver, watching as the final pieces of the Patterson empire were dismantled by federal prosecutors. The room was packed with spectators, journalists and officials who had come to witness what newspapers were calling the most significant corruption trial in territorial history. At the defense table sat 3 men who had once wielded enormous power: Territorial Judge Harrison Wells, Senator Marcus Whitfield, and Railroad Executive Charles Brennan. All 3 had been arrested based on evidence found in Marcus Patterson's hidden documents, and all 3 now faced federal charges that could result in decades in prison. The prosecution calls Miss Emma Collins to the stand, announced the federal prosecutor. A sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Morrison, who had been sent from Washington specifically to handle this case. Emma rose from her seat in the gallery, her composure remarkable for someone who had endured so much trauma just weeks earlier. She had grown noticeably more confident since that terrible day in the canyon, and Rebecca felt a surge of pride watching her younger sister walk to the witness stand with her head held high. "Miss Collins," Prosecutor Morrison began, "please tell the court about the conversation you had with your brother-in-law, Marcus Patterson, regarding what he called the truth where rivers meet the sky." Emma's voice was clear and steady as she recounted Marcus's cryptic message and how they had eventually located the hidden evidence. But it was when she described the contents of those documents that the courtroom fell completely silent. The papers showed that Judge Wells had been receiving monthly payments of $500 in exchange for favorable rulings in land disputes, Emma testified. Senator Whitfield had accepted bribes totaling over $20,000 to influence territorial legislation regarding railroad rights-of-way, and Mr. Brennan had knowingly purchased fraudulent land titles from Jeremiah Patterson, often at prices far below market value, knowing the land had been stolen from legitimate owners. From her seat in the gallery, Rebecca watched the faces of the defendants. Judge Wells stared at his hands, his once imposing figure now seeming small and defeated. Senator Whitfield maintained a facade of indignation, but sweat beaded on his forehead. Charles Brennan whispered urgently to his lawyer, his face flushed with panic. The cross-examination was brutal, but Emma held firm, her testimony unshakable because it was built on documented facts rather than mere accusations. When she finally stepped down from the witness stand, Rebecca felt a profound sense of justice beginning to unfold. Jake Morrison, who had been sitting beside Rebecca throughout the trial, leaned over and whispered, "She's stronger than any of them realize." Rebecca nodded, watching Emma return to her seat. "She always was. She just needed a chance to show it." The trial had been preceded by weeks of investigation that had uncovered the full scope of the Patterson corruption network. Thomas Patterson had been true to his word, providing detailed information about his family's illegal activities and helping investigators trace the flow of stolen money through various banks and investment schemes. His cooperation had earned him immunity from prosecution, but Rebecca could see the toll it had taken on him. He sat in the back of the courtroom, his face gaunt, looking like a man who had aged years in the space of weeks. Exposing his family's crimes had been the right thing to do, but it had cost him everything he had once thought he valued. The proceedings were interrupted when Sheriff Hendricks entered the courtroom and made his way to the prosecutor's table. He handed Catherine Morrison a telegram, which she read quickly before standing to address the judge. "Your Honor, I've just received word from Pine Ridge regarding a significant development. 3 more territorial officials have been arrested based on evidence uncovered during the ongoing investigation. The corruption network was apparently even more extensive than we initially believed." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Rebecca felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that justice was being served, but sadness at discovering how deeply corruption had infected the territorial government. During the lunch recess, Rebecca and Emma walked through downtown Denver with Jake, marveling at the bustling city that seemed so different from the frontier town they now called home. The territorial capital was full of energy and opportunity, but Rebecca found herself missing the quiet spaces and clear air of the mountains. "Have you thought any more about Jake's offer?" Emma asked as they sat in a small restaurant near the courthouse. Rebecca had been thinking about little else for weeks. Jake's proposal of a business partnership had evolved into something more complex and appealing during their time in Denver. He had shown them financial records from his ranch, discussed expansion possibilities, and outlined a vision for building something that could provide security and independence for all of them. But more than the business opportunity, Rebecca found herself drawn to the man himself. Jake Morrison had revealed depths of character during their ordeal that went far beyond the quiet rancher she had first met. He was thoughtful, principled, and remarkably patient with both sisters as they worked through the trauma of their experiences. "I think it could work," Rebecca said carefully. "The business partnership, I mean. We know cattle ranching from father's dealings with local ranchers, and we understand commerce from running the mercantile. Jake knows the land and has established relationships with buyers." Emma grinned. "I wasn't just talking about the business partnership." Rebecca felt her cheeks warm. It was true that her feelings for Jake had grown beyond simple gratitude, but the timing seemed complicated. She was still technically in mourning for Marcus, and the circumstances of their meeting had been so traumatic that she sometimes wondered if her emotions were simply a response to being rescued. "It's too soon to think about other things," Rebecca said quietly. "Is it?" Emma asked. "Marcus has been gone for months, and he would have wanted you to be happy. Besides, some situations make people realize what's really important faster than they normally would." Before Rebecca could respond, Jake returned to their table with news that changed everything. "I just spoke with Sheriff Hendricks. The territorial governor wants to meet with us this afternoon. Apparently, our testimony and the evidence we uncovered have impressed some important people in Washington." The meeting with Territorial Governor William Hayes took place in his private office, a grand room decorated with maps, territorial flags, and portraits of previous governors. Hayes was a tall, distinguished man in his 50s, with the kind of presence that commanded attention without effort. "Ladies, Mr. Morrison," he began, gesturing for them to take seats across from his desk. "What you've accomplished goes far beyond exposing one family's crimes. You've helped uncover a corruption network that was undermining the very foundations of territorial government." Rebecca noticed that Emma sat straighter in her chair, clearly impressed by the formal recognition of their efforts. "The question now," Governor Hayes continued, "is how we rebuild trust in our institutions and ensure that this kind of systematic corruption never happens again. That's why I wanted to speak with you personally." Jake leaned forward slightly. "What did you have in mind, Governor?" "I want to offer Miss Rebecca Collins a position as Territorial Administrator for Land Disputes," Hayes said. "Her experience with the mercantile business, combined with her first-hand knowledge of how corruption affects honest citizens, makes her uniquely qualified to help reform our land management systems." Rebecca was stunned. A territorial appointment was a significant honor, and the position would carry real influence in shaping policy. "And Miss Emma Collins," the governor continued, "I understand you have considerable education and natural investigative abilities. I'd like to offer you a position as assistant to the Territorial Attorney General, helping to root out remaining corruption and prosecute ongoing cases." Emma's eyes widened. I would be honored, Governor, but I'm only 18, and I have no formal legal training." "Legal training can be acquired," Hayes replied with a smile. "Integrity and courage cannot be taught. You've already demonstrated both in abundance." Jake had been listening quietly, but now he spoke up. "Governor, I appreciate the recognition you're giving these ladies, but they've been through a tremendous ordeal. They need time to heal and rebuild their lives." "Of course," Hayes agreed. "These positions would be based here in Denver, with housing and support provided. But there's no rush to decide. Take all the time you need." As they left the governor's office, Rebecca's mind was spinning with possibilities. A territorial appointment would provide security and the opportunity to make a real difference in reforming corrupt systems. But it would also mean leaving Pine Ridge, leaving the quiet mountains where she had begun to heal, and potentially leaving Jake. That evening in their hotel room, Emma voiced what they were both thinking. "These are incredible opportunities, Rebecca. The kind of chances women rarely get in the territories." "I know," Rebecca replied, staring out the window at the gaslit streets of Denver. "And they're the kind of positions that could help prevent other families from going through what we experienced. But Emma prompted, but I keep thinking about what we've built with Jake. Not just the potential business partnership, but the feeling of having a home again. A family. Emma sat on the bed beside her sister. You're in love with him. It wasn't a question, and Rebecca didn't try to deny it. I think I am. But is that fair to him? To Marcus's memory? To you? Marcus would want you to be happy, Emma said firmly. And Jake? Anyone can see how he looks at you, Rebecca. He's been in love with you since that first day in the canyon. Maybe since the moment he decided to risk his life to save us. And what about you? Rebecca asked. The governor's offer is an amazing opportunity for you. Emma was quiet for a long moment. I've been thinking about that. The position in Denver would be exciting, challenging. But I've also been thinking about what Father always said about education. What do you mean? He said education wasn't just about accumulating knowledge. It was about using that knowledge to help your community. Maybe I could do more good helping to build something honest and lasting in Pine Ridge than I could working in the territorial bureaucracy. You'd give up a territorial appointment to become a cattle rancher? Rebecca asked, surprised. Emma laughed. Why not? Cattle ranching with the right partners could be just as challenging and rewarding as government work. And it would let us stay together, stay with Jake, and help rebuild the community that the Pattersons tried to destroy. That night, Rebecca lay awake thinking about choices and futures, about the difference between safety and happiness, between obligation and desire. By morning, she had made her decision. The next day, they returned to Governor Hayes' office with their answer. Rebecca declined the territorial appointment, but made a counterproposal that surprised everyone. Governor, what if instead of working within the territorial government, we helped create a model for honest governance at the local level? Jake's ranch could become more than just a cattle operation. It could be the center of a new kind of community, one built on transparent business practices and genuine democratic participation. Emma picked up the thread. We could establish Pine Ridge as a demonstration of how communities can govern themselves honestly and effectively. The lessons learned there could then be applied throughout the territory. Governor Hayes leaned back in his chair, intrigued. You're talking about creating a kind of laboratory for democratic governance. Exactly, Rebecca said. And we'd document everything, the successes, the failures, the lessons learned. The territorial government could use our experiences to guide reforms in other communities. Jake had been listening with growing amazement. You want to turn a cattle ranch into a political experiment? I want to turn it into proof that honest people can build honest communities, Rebecca replied. And I want to do it with you. The words hung in the air between them, carrying meanings that went far beyond business partnerships and political reforms. Jake's eyes met Rebecca's, and in that moment they both understood that they were talking about much more than cattle and governance. They were talking about building a life together. Governor Hayes smiled. I think that might be the most interesting proposal I've heard since taking office. Let's discuss the details. 1 year later, Rebecca Morrison stood on the porch of the house she now shared with her husband Jake, watching the sun set over the Colorado mountains that had once seemed like a prison, but now felt like home. The view from their expanded ranch house looked out over pastures where cattle grazed peacefully, fields where crops grew in neat rows, and a small cluster of buildings that had become the heart of something unprecedented in the American territories. The community they had built around the Double Creek ranch had grown to include 43 families, each with their own plot of land, but all working together in a cooperative that shared resources, knowledge, and profits equitably. What had started as Jake's proposal for a business partnership had evolved into something much more ambitious, a working demonstration that honest governance and community cooperation could create prosperity for everyone, not just those at the top. Emma Collins Whitmore. She had married Thomas Patterson 6 months earlier, a union that had surprised many but made perfect sense to those who knew them both, emerged from the new schoolhouse carrying a stack of books and papers. At 19, she had become the community's teacher, teaching not just reading and arithmetic, but also principles of democratic participation and civic responsibility. "The harvest numbers are in," Emma called out as she approached the porch. "We exceeded our projections by 18%, and every family will receive their full profit share plus a bonus for the Community Improvement Fund." Rebecca smiled, remembering the frightened girl who had once begged to be taken instead of her sister. That girl had grown into a confident young woman who could calculate commodity prices, mediate disputes between neighbors, and teach children to read with equal skill. "What's Thomas's report from town?" Rebecca asked, referring to Emma's husband's weekly trip to Pine Ridge. "3 more families want to join the cooperative," Emma replied, settling into one of the rocking chairs Jake had built for the porch. "And Governor Hayes wants to bring a delegation of territorial officials to observe our community council meeting next month." The success of their experimental community had attracted attention throughout the territories and even back in Washington. Representatives from other Western settlements had come to study their methods, and several communities had already begun implementing similar cooperative structures. But the true measure of their success, Rebecca knew, wasn't in the political attention or the economic prosperity. It was in the faces of the people who lived here, faces that showed hope instead of fear, cooperation instead of suspicion, and the confidence that came from having a real voice in their own governance. Jake emerged from the barn, leading Thunder, who was now showing grey around his muzzle but was still strong and reliable. The sight of her husband always made Rebecca's heart lift, even after a year of marriage. Their relationship had grown from the crisis that brought them together into something deep and enduring, built on shared values and complementary strengths. "Council meeting tomorrow night," Jake said, settling beside Rebecca on the porch. "We need to discuss the water rights issue with the mineral claims upstream. It was a complex problem that would have been solved through intimidation and corruption in the old Patterson days. Now it would be addressed through negotiation, legal research, and community input, slower perhaps, but more sustainable and just." "Any word from Sheriff Hendricks about the sentencing?" Rebecca asked. "Judge Wells got 15 years in federal prison," Jake replied. "Senator Whitfield got 12. Brennan got 10, but he has to pay restitution of $40,000 to the families whose land was stolen." Justice had been slow but thorough. The trials had concluded 6 months earlier, with convictions on all major charges. More importantly, the territorial government had implemented new oversight measures and transparency requirements that made it much harder for corruption to take root. Emma looked up from the papers she was grading. "I got a letter from Catherine Morrison today. She said there are talks in Washington about statehood for the territory, partly because our reforms have shown that Western communities can govern themselves effectively." Rebecca felt a surge of pride. When she had first offered herself in place of her sister, she had only been thinking about immediate survival. She could never have imagined that their struggle would contribute to something as significant as statehood. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the road that led from Pine Ridge. A lone rider was approaching, and as he drew closer, Rebecca recognized Dr. Samuel Hayes, the territorial governor's nephew, who served as the community's physician. "Evening." "Doc," Jake called out as the man dismounted. "Everything all right?" Dr. Hayes removed his hat, grinning broadly. "More than all right. I just got word from Denver. Congress passed the Statehood Enabling Act. Colorado will be a state within the year, and they want to use our community governance model as a template for local government throughout the new state." The news was met with cheers from the small group on the porch, but Rebecca felt a deeper satisfaction than mere celebration. They had proven that alternatives to corruption and intimidation were not only possible, but profitable and sustainable. As the evening progressed, more community members gathered on the porch to discuss the implications of statehood and to plan for the challenges it would bring. Rebecca listened to the animated conversations around her. Farmers discussing crop rotation, teachers debating curriculum, merchants planning for expanded trade routes. These were the voices of democracy in action, she realized. Not the speeches of politicians or the proclamations of officials, but the practical discussions of ordinary people working together to solve common problems. Later that night, after the visitors had gone home and Emma had returned to her own house with Thomas, Rebecca and Jake sat alone on the porch, enjoying the quiet that came after a day of productive work. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't heard us that day?" Rebecca asked, leaning against Jake's shoulder. Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I try not to dwell on what-ifs," he said finally, "but I know my life would have been a lot emptier. Not just because I wouldn't have met you and Emma, but because I wouldn't have discovered what was possible when people worked together for something bigger than themselves." Rebecca nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Before that terrible day in the canyon, she had thought in terms of individual survival, protecting herself and Emma, maintaining their small business, avoiding the attention of powerful people who might harm them. Now she thought in terms of community building, sustainable systems, and creating opportunities for others to thrive. The trauma that had nearly destroyed them had ultimately led to a kind of growth and purpose she could never have imagined. "I've been thinking about something," Rebecca said. "Emma and I will always be grateful that you saved us that day. But I think maybe we saved you too." Jake smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes and transformed his normally serious expression. "You definitely saved me. Before that day, I was just existing, going through the motions of living without any real purpose beyond keeping my ranch running. You two gave me something to fight for, something to build toward. A shooting star streaked across the clear mountain sky, and Rebecca made a silent wish, not for her own happiness, which she had already found, but for the continued success of the community they had built, and for the courage to keep working toward a more just and equitable world. Emma's voice carried across the distance from her own porch, where she was saying goodnight to Thomas. "Rebecca, Jake, look at the sky." They looked up to see the aurora borealis dancing across the northern horizon, unusual this far south, but spectacular in its beauty. The green and gold lights rippled like celestial rivers flowing across the vast Colorado sky. "Rivers meeting the sky," Rebecca whispered, remembering Marcus's cryptic clue that had led them to the evidence that brought down the Patterson Empire. "New rivers," Jake added, understanding her meaning, "starting fresh, flowing towards something better." As they watched the aurora fade into the star-filled night, Rebecca thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with terror and desperation, with a sister's willingness to sacrifice herself for someone she loved. It had continued through violence and corruption, through the discovery of hidden truths and the courage to stand up to injustice. But it had led to this, a home built on love and shared values, a community founded on cooperation and mutual respect, and a future full of possibility for growth and positive change. The little girl who had once begged cruel in-laws to take her instead of her sister had grown into a woman who understood that the choice was never really between saving one person or another. The choice was always between despair and hope, between accepting injustice and working to create something better. And sometimes, when you refuse to accept that anyone has to be sacrificed, when you insist that everyone deserves protection and opportunity, you discover that salvation multiplies rather than divides. In the quiet of the Colorado night, with her husband beside her and her sister's laughter echoing from across the cooperative they had built together, Rebecca Morrison understood that this was what Marcus had really meant when he spoke of where rivers meet the sky. It wasn't a hiding place for evidence of past crimes. It was a meeting point for new beginnings, where the streams of individual lives converged into something larger and more beautiful than any one person could create alone. And in that convergence, In that choice to build rather than merely survive, they had found not just safety and prosperity, but purpose and joy that would flow forward like rivers, nourishing generations yet to come. The story that had begun with a desperate plea, "Take me instead of my sister," had become something none of them could have imagined, a testament to the power of refusing to choose who deserves salvation, and insisting instead that everyone deserves the chance to thrive. In the end, Jake Morrison had kept his word. He had taken them both, not as rescued victims, but as equal partners in building a future worthy of the courage they had shown in their darkest hour, and the rivers that met the sky that night carried their story forward, a testament to the truth that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to let anyone be left behind. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.